If you spend enough time on the internet, you could easily convince yourself, I think, that the Loch Ness Monster is real, that the moon landings were faked. If you spend enough time in a very remote environment, you can pretty much be forgiven for imagining all sorts of things because your mind plays funny tricks. What about a quest for the Yeti? Would that be a reason to perhaps take a trip to the Himalayas? Well, some of us might say no, but some of us might say yes. And in the yes camp is our next speaker. Please welcome to the stage, Andrew Benfield.
Thank you very much indeed. So I was living in India a few years back, and one day I'm going through some old archives, and I chance upon this. Looks a bit boring. It's a 1959 memo from the US Embassy in Kathmandu, and it's entitled Regulations for Expeditions Relating to the Yeti. So I thought, wow, this looks pretty interesting. Started doing some more research. Eventually convinced myself there might actually be something to this Yeti thing. So I then discussed it with my much smarter friend, Richard, who quickly became convinced that there might actually not. And eventually, one night, to shut me up, he bet me I couldn't go and find one. So after a few more glasses of wine, I accepted on the condition he come along with me as the kind of expedition skeptic and also the responsible adult. So, like Gandalf and Bilbo, off we set to Arunachal Pradesh. This is a remote area of northeast India, borders Bhutan and Tibet. Pretty rough roads to get up there. So I thought a couple of old motorcycles would be just the ticket. Turns out Richard can't ride a motorcycle, who knew? But he did a sterling job, I must say. Only, I think, 3 crashes in the first day, and a small incident where we had to be rescued by the Indian Army. But apart from that, we had a lovely couple of weeks biking and hiking around the Himalayas. So the burning question, did we actually see any Yetis? Absolutely not. But we did find a number of stories about something called a grepu. This lady's father was famous for having shot one in the 50s. This couple told us one had attacked their dog around the campfire one night. And this nomad took us up to a memorial where someone had been killed by one, allegedly, in 2005. So we were a bit taken aback. Appetites whetted. A few months later, we headed off to northern Burma, Kachin State. For some reason, Richard banned the motorcycles this time, but I managed to get hold of a 60-year-old Land Rover called Lucy. Now, Lucy lived up to her name very, very well, in that most of the engine, the doors, the wheels were all very, very loose. So a lot of breakdowns later, and a long slog up through the jungle, we eventually made it up to the beautiful Burmese Himalayas. But it was again Richard 1 and Yetis 0. However, a lot of stories about something called a Nye Bibi. This gentleman told us he'd shot one with this very crossbow back in the day. These 2 ex-British Army mountaineers said they'd seen one while climbing. And this lady said she chanced upon one in the forest while foraging one day. The interesting thing was, different country, remote area, limited connectivity, different language, they're describing something very, very similar to what we'd heard about in India. But not, I'm sorry to disappoint you, a big white hairy snow monster. It turns out that's a complete Western invention. Instead, a bipedal ape-like creature, orange-brown hair, apparently very stinky, apparently a bit grumpy. The interesting thing is, we now know there was a big ape that used to roam around the Himalayas. It was called Gigantopithecus. And the fossil evidence shows closest living relative is the orangutan. When we meet people who've had a sighting, we show them some animal photos and say, you know, which one was it most similar to? And it's the orangutan that is always the one that they usually pick out. Now, apart from getting the depiction wrong, the Western Yeti narrative tends to start mid-19th century with people like me and Richard, like middle-aged white men, colonial officers, explorers back then. But the local stories, it turns out, go back really centuries. Now, it's often an oral tradition, but you can find old temple art, old drawings like this. And their attitude to the creature is also very different. We know it exists, it's something to be feared and revered. You know, that's very different from the normal Western approach, which is we must shoot this thing, get it back to the British Museum, and hopefully bag a lecture at the Royal Geographical Society. Okay, it's a big ego trip. So back to the middle-aged white men. COVID stops play. It's only last December we can get out again. Solakhumbu region up near Everest in Nepal. So, like a good boy, I get myself out there, wait for Richard. He duly does not arrive because new restrictions kick in. So like everyone else, we kept calm, we carried on, and we got on Zoom. And so for the next month, whenever we had a connection, he would provide expert guidance while I risked my life. We also took some guidance from the 1950s snowman expedition. Now, despite their, I think, 300 porters, a bunch of elephant guns, a cage, and being sponsored by the Daily Mail, believe it or not, they didn't come back with a Yeti. But the book is full of stories with consistent local accounts and naming the places, so that gave us some guidance where to go. We tracked down the victim of a 1970s Yeti attack, seen as so credible, it was reported in the Sunday Times at the time. I went and looked at alleged Yeti relics, such as this scalp in monasteries in the region. Then I got a bit distracted, and without Richard's guiding hand, a local mountaineer whispered to me there were nomads in far western Nepal wearing Yeti hair necklaces. I mean, come on, right? So a couple of small dodgy planes, a helicopter, and a jeep later, I eventually tracked them down near the Tibetan border. Now, over these 3 trips, we've kind of stopped looking for a Yeti and focused on the people, because they live up there and they're lucky to see one in a lifetime. But yes, we hope that eventually a story leads to some bone or scat or hair we can get analyzed. And no, we're not just collecting stories, right? We don't believe everything we hear. There are charlatans, of course, as everywhere. A gentleman in Burma told us in front of his wife, every night after she goes to bed, Yeti comes to the hut and drinks all the alcohol. Okay. But there are now so many credible stories, first-hand stories by all of these people and more, that survive even Richard's questioning, that, you know, it's hard to dismiss them all as fantasists, especially when you're up there, they're keeping you alive with their knowledge of local flora and fauna. They're experts at this stuff, right? But dismiss is what so many lowlanders do. And a Sherpa gentleman said to me, this is what I call low-altitude sickness. It's the low-altitude people who think mountain people can't possibly know anything that's not already on Wikipedia. When you're up there as well, you see the topographical possibility for something to exist pretty much unseen. Finally, the journeys, I guess, have become, as a previous speaker said as well, kind of as important as the destination. I mean, if the Yeti was said to come or would be found where I'm from, which is Essex originally, and to be fair, there's some fairly exotic creatures in the Basildon area. Some of them are here tonight. I probably wouldn't be looking for it, but we get to go to the Himalayas. It's awesome, it's beautiful, it's humbling, it puts your own ego and worries in perspective. And we get into local culture, because we're not just trekking around or trying to summit something with all due respect to mountaineers, but we get into local culture and people. And finally, we do tend to have quite a little bit of fun. There is some audio on this? Yes, okay.
पलीता नाम अंदर बैठ किताबा नाम रहिंदा भांगी शराबा नाम रहिंदा मस्त खराबा नाम शादी नाम नाकी नाम विच पलीती पाकी नाम अभिनव काकी नाम आतश नाम बुल्ला की जाना मैं कौन बुल्ला की जाना मैं कौन बुल्ला की जाना मैं कौन बुल्ला की जाना मैं कौन
Thank you very much. And he's here tonight, my friend Richard. He made it this time. Thank you.
Lovely. Team Yeti. Brilliant. Do we have questions from the floor and or questions from the Tinterweb people? I've got questions. Is that part of a film that you're making that we can watch somewhere?
It was never the plan, but then we bumped into a TV director who's here tonight in Burma, and he said streaming networks are so desperate, the bars are so low these days, that we might even get you on TV. So it is now maybe happening.
Very exciting.
Yes.
And do you have another chapter of Yeti hunting that means that you might head out?
Where are we
back into
going?
the high
You
mountains?
choose the vehicle this time. Okay.
Bhutan by
Bhutan.
mule.
Mule, okay.
Yeah.
So mule's good, motorbike's bad.
Motorbikes, yeah. If you,
Okay.
Arunachal Pradesh, it's like this, not very good.
Traditionally, no one has ever fallen off a mule, so it's fine.
Yeah,
You'll be fine. You'll be fine. Were you able to find any hair samples or other items to analyse? Asks one of our audience members at home.
So, yes, the nomads came up trumps and amazingly delivered me a hair sample.
And?
I don't have it here tonight, sorry. We're now getting it analysed, so we're getting a DNA analysis done, and then you'll see us on the news soon. Yeah.
Brilliant. Yes?
When was the first time you went to the Himalayas in search of the Yeti, and how long have you spent there in total looking for it?
I guess our first trip was about 3 weeks or something.
Yeah, 2019.
Yeah, and then Burma was a little bit after that for
Yeah.
about a month or something. And then the last trip was about 6 weeks. But we've both kind of lived and worked actually in the region for many, many years. So we've had other trips up there and got a bit familiar with the area and heard stories, yeah.
Cool. It looks like a lot of fun. Do you really, really, really believe that the Yeti is out there?
Well, you were the skeptical one, right? So what are you? You're convinced now, right?
Absolutely. I'm 100% convinced that there's something in these stories. You look these people in the eye and they're not spinning you a yarn. Whether that thing is a Yeti as we understand it, or whether there's ancestral memories that are being triggered, oral tradition, it's hard to say. But I came back from these trips much more convinced that there's something worth examining and taking seriously, whatever it turns out to be, than I was at the beginning, where I kind of dismissed it as a Loch Ness Monster type of escapade.
I get very annoyed with the Loch Ness Monster thing. It's like, clearly there's not a dinosaur in a lake in Scotland. This is not the same thing. So please don't ask me that at the bar, okay?
Okay. Understood. Okay, thank you.
Hi, just wondering, when you were speaking to people, were they hesitant or were they really forthcoming when you were investigating this, or was it hit and miss with different people, or was this something they were happy to talk about and to discuss with you?
Yeah, I mean, these are creatures that are talked about in folklore as well as in real-life experiences. So the higher altitude you get, actually, and the more remote you get, it shifts from being something which is talked about in a sort of mythical sense to something where you meet hunters, yak herders, people who live in this very high mountain environment, who talk about it as a real creature. And that's a really striking difference. You can go to a small town, high up in the Himalayas, where they'll talk about it in religious or mythical terms, but as soon as you get out to these communities, they're talking about their grandparents, their parents, their friend, maybe even themselves having encountered one. And that's quite striking, yeah.
I think also it's not just nomads and yak herders, it's also, mountaineers, both local and foreign. It's the Dalai Lama's oracle, who we met. No, it was the second oracle. The first one wasn't available yet. But I mean, so it's a wide range of people, right, that really think there's something there, yeah.
Cool. Thank you. I think this is going to be our last question. Sorry to everybody. Oh, okay, and then you. So one, and then two.
What's your hypothesis for what it is biologically?
Three main theories overall, right? One is it's a bear, which is Reinhold Messner, the famous climber's theory. One is that it's a relic hominid, so it's some kind of Homo floresiensis kind of thing that died out recently, and the other is some kind of ape. I mean, our conclusion basically is it is some kind of ape by the sound of it. That seems to be the closest thing, yeah. That's
in existence now, that is currently extant?
Yes, I think much rarer. In the 50s, I mean, the stories were, there are so many in that book, it's phenomenal. I mean, now it's much harder, you have to go much further, you're talking to older people, but we have had things that are recent, I mean, in the last kind of, few years, but it seems we think with COVID, maybe that's kind of helped, if people have kind of stayed in more, so the Yetis might be coming out.
Yetis.
Yeah.
As the resident skeptic, I have to
I
have to say that whether it's extant or not is still very much open question in my mind. I think possibly not, but could have been much more recently than the fossil evidence of Gigantopithecus, which goes back 100,000 years, right? So, yeah, but let's see.
Well, we wait and see. Okay, last question, and then I'm really sorry, we have to stop. Oh.
If the first series is a success on the TV, any ideas what series 2 is going to be about?
The Loch Ness Monster, surely.
So I live in Australia, and I'm planning to move soon to Tasmania, and there's stories of the...
devil?
No, the devil still lives.
Oh, okay. Right. Well, that's done then.
It has a rare facial cancer, but it still lives. But there is the Tasmanian tiger, the thylacine, and there are lots and lots of stories of that being there. So that might be something that's worth looking at. I don't know if, I'm too skeptical about it or not, but that might be an interesting one. I don't know if I can convince Andy to...
Absolutely, let's do it.
Yeah, all right.
Oh, there you go, you heard it here first. They're on the hunt for the thylacine. Dave, Andrew and Richard, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.